I'm going to share with you a couple of really important tips that I wish I knew before I started out painting in watercolour. Let's get started. So I'm using these small thumbnails to give you examples of these lessons that I had to learn the hard way. And it's going to be the same little painting and using the same colours as well. I'm just mixing up some ultramarine blue, some cerulean and a little bit of Paynes grey in the ultramarine. I'm just going to paint a sort of simple skyscape, some green grasses in the foreground using the Paynes grey or blue and yellow, just keeping it really, really simple. So I'm using my size 6 brush. I'm painting wet on dry, the ultramarine and the Paynes grey, and now the cerulean. So it's all just sort of just playing, just sort of, you know, not really thinking too much. I've just applied a little bit more Paynes grey there for a dark stormy sky, and I'm just sort of diluting the foreground there, mixing up a green using yellow and the cerulean, and just painting this in the foreground, wet into wet, adding a little bit more Paynes grey to make the colour darker, and I'm going to paint this damp into wet in the foreground there to create the darker grasses. So I'm mixing up very similar colours, the ultramarine, the Paynes grey, the cerulean. You can even just use your own green. Just use whatever colours you fancy. I'm actually using a slightly bigger brush now, and I'm painting the Paynes grey, the ultramarine, still wet on dry, the cerulean towards the horizon, sort of, and now rinsing again and just diluting and softening towards the horizon, and then painting on some green grasses. It's kind of a little bit of wet in wet there. And I'm just using some yellow and Quinacridone gold, painting wet into wet. I have to keep rinsing my brush all the time, and I'm actually now painting damp into damp some grasses in the foreground here. Importantly, when you're working wet into wet, what you don't want to do is put wetter washes into a drying washer. These are thick and creamy, which is what you should do. And for my third and final little thumbnail, I'm mixing up exactly the sort of same colours, painting wet on dry. I'm using a size 6 brush, but I found the 10 that I did in the middle there easier to apply the paint. And I'm just sort of painting on this Paynes grey sky with a touch of ultramarine. I'm sort of mixing it up a little bit here, putting on the cerulean. So while I'm letting that do something, I didn't want to do any more to it because the painting now on the left, the shine has almost gone, okay? Now, I wanted to show you that this is the worst time to paint a watercolour, when the shine is almost, when it's literally gone. So the one in the middle, the shine is still there. So do not paint when it's like that one on the left hand side, when the shine is kind of just gone. The painting is deceptively dry. Unless you put neat watercolour paint straight from the tube, you'll always get cauliflowers because your brush will always be wetter now than the paper itself. And this is the main thing I wish I knew earlier when I started in watercolour. Always allow your paintings to dry when the sheen has gone. So you can see there I've just applied some Paynes grey for a darker, stormier sky, and I'm going to get a really ugly background. As you can see, it's developing there. They're also known as cauliflowers or blooms. So to avoid them, make sure your painting is dried thoroughly. So my middle thumbnail has still got a sheen, so it's safe to paint, but it is starting to dry off. So you must make sure that you put on thicker, creamier paint. Anything wetter is going to end up like the one on the left, especially when the shine goes. Look at that back run. I mean, it's a good back run. So if you want to know how to do back runs, put a wet wash into one that's drying, and that's how it happens. But yes, so here we are. I've forgotten to paint this one on the right hand side. There's so much happening, 3 paintings on the go. It's still nice and wet, as you can see. It's a lovely sheen, so it's safe for me to paint still. So I'm just painting a little bit of green at the bottom there, using similar colours as I did before. Want to paint a darker sky now at the top. I've got to make sure the shine's there, so I tilt it up to the light and I apply the same consistency of paint or even creamier on the surface so I don't get back runs. So I'm just going to revisit this deceptively damp painting. It's still, you know, not dry, but this is going back into a painting when you're not sure and you're trying to work things out and you're fiddling. So I'd really say try to avoid fiddling at all costs. If you're not sure about what to do, don't paint. I know that sounds really strange, but it really works. Just let your painting dry. You'll find by the time you go back to it, you've got more of a clear head. Sometimes watercolour lulls us in and makes us paint more than what we should do. So really stop yourself. I just thought I'd give you a little example of overworking and fiddling with a painting. So I've just sort of going along here, doing everything right. I've wet the surface. I'm just painting in wet here with some Paynes grey. So it's I'm sort of building up my sky, the darks in the sky. I'm using my size 10 brush. I'm just putting some grasses here in the foreground, and the grasses have run a little bit where I've wet it, so I'm getting into a bit of trouble here now. So it's kind of panic sometimes, and I've just put too much water in there and I'm blobbing off, and now I'm thinking, oh, that looks a mess, and you can't stop yourself now you're kind of getting into danger. What I would say is stop. Just stop now. Don't do any more. Let it dry and then work on it wet on dry. Don't keep at it trying to solve the problem. Just let it dry. So here now, because I'm sort of panicking, overworking, well, I'm not really panicking, but I keep applying paint to it. It's starting to lift off the underpainting as well, because that wetness is starting to disturb that paint underneath, because remember, watercolour is not permanent. So I'm getting into all sorts of problems here, messing with the sky, messing with the foreground, instead of just leaving it alone when it started to become a bit of a problem, letting it dry. So this is an example now on the right hand side about what you should do, painting the sky, wet in wet, putting some grasses in, and just leaving things sort of simpler, and less is more, especially when you're starting out as a beginner. Don't try and do too much, and don't be too hard on yourselves if things don't work out. It's fine. We all have to learn that sort of timing in watercolour as well. So I'm just finishing off the sky, adding the slightly creamier wash. So always make sure it's the same consistency or a little bit thicker than the wash underneath. And I thought you'd find it really helpful to see the small thumbnail paintings once they are dry. If you notice the little thumbnail painting on the left, you can see that cauliflower really has dried, very dominant, and you can imagine doing this in your sky and how much it's distracting to the rest of the painting. And a lot of the times I find students panic and they try to get rid of that cauliflower, and it actually makes more of a mess. So it's best just to learn that lesson and move on from it. And as you can see, the middle thumbnail painting, that's where I started to sort of mess about with it. Even though there was still a sheen there, I wanted to make more corrections, etc. But you can see you still end up with cauliflowers and blooms, and actually if you look at the foreground, it's actually quite muddy because I just kept sort of playing around with it, hoping I could make corrections and change it. But again, you have to let that painting dry, and once you do, your watercolours will change overnight. So I really hope you find this tutorial helpful. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.